Right. So welcome everyone. I'm going to do speak. Okay. So, all right. So hello everyone. My name is Juan Carlos Lopez. I'm coming to you from Mi'kmaq, the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. When I say this, I want to talk about my commitment to learning the truth, and to do that I listen and listen and listen, and like a very dear colleague of me says, when I'm done listening I come back and listen some more, and again to learn the truth, and in doing so I want to follow the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, so that we walk towards reconciliation. I also want to acknowledge that Nova Scotia and this area has had several waves of people of African descent that have come and make life in these lands, and it's been at least 400 years of the recorded waves of people who have come in this land, and I also want to, with the same spirit, I want to learn from these experiences and move towards a better future for all of us. And I say this as an immigrant and settler in these lands. So thank you very much for joining us. Most of us come from university, so we recognize that this is a very busy time, but I'm really glad to see so many people coming in and joining us in the talk. Today we're here with a special, we're hosting Jay Laurendeau from University of Lethbridge, who kindly agreed to come and talk to us. So I am going to mute myself, and I'm going to let Jay take it from here. So go right ahead, Jay.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. Thank you, Juan Carlos, for the land acknowledgement, a thoughtful one, I'll note, and for the introduction. I want to thank Angie Colon as well. For suggesting my name to this series, and Juan Carlos for all of the organizational work that he's done. I'm just going to share my screen here, folks. Okay. So again, my thanks for being here. It is a busy time of the semester. I was giving my September self a little grief yesterday, wondering why I said yes to a talk at this particular time of year. But now that we're here, I'm delighted to be here with everyone and to see some names that I know in the Zoom room, as well as some names that I hope to get to know a little bit better. So thank you, everyone. I join you today from Sikóóhkotok, lands claimed by the city of Lethbridge, the province of Alberta, and the still settling state of Canada, what many of us would know as Lethbridge, Alberta. Sikóóhkotok is part of Blackfoot Confederacy territories, which extend from the North Saskatchewan River to the Yellowstone River north to south, and the Rocky Mountains to the confluence of the North and South Saskatchewan Rivers west to east. Blackfoot peoples have cared for these lands since time immemorial, and many other Indigenous peoples, including the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, including the Stoney Nakoda Nation, and many more, have cared for these lands since time immemorial. And many other Indigenous peoples have and continue to take up their responsibilities in relation to these territories. These lands have nourished me personally and professionally for most of my life. This is the kind of land acknowledgement we often hear in academic and other spaces. If you too are living in Canada or another settler state, I invite you to think about the lands you occupy and your indebtedness to those who have cared for these lands since time immemorial. This is the kind of land acknowledgement we often hear in academic and other spaces, and it is incomplete, arguably even dangerously so. Acknowledging the lands, waters, etc. is important, and it does nothing to highlight what we are doing about our occupation of these lands. Juan Carlos refused that logic in naming some of the things that he's doing specifically. Those of us who are settlers, in other words, need to do more than simply acknowledge our presence on these lands. We need, in Lex and scholar Rachel Flowers' words, to think through the term settler as a set of responsibilities and action. Anishinaabe scholar Tricia McGuire-Adams builds on Flower's work, arguing to call oneself a settler is not about signifying if one is non-Indigenous. Rather, it ignites responsibilities that call attention to the decentering of whiteness, the disruption of privilege, and the enactment of anti-racist relationships with Indigenous peoples, communities, and territories. End quote. With that in mind, I urge you to think again about the lands that you occupy. More specifically, I urge you to think about your relationship to those lands. In what ways, if at all, are you taking up your own responsibility to those lands and the Indigenous peoples who have called them home for millennia? What specific actions are you taking to reckon with those responsibilities? I invite you to reflect on that privately for just a moment. It's important at the outset to situate myself for listeners today. I think and write from my positioning as a cisgender, heterosexual, non-disabled white settler. Here, I point not to some biological realities about my life, but to how my identity, my very being in the world, is produced by the systems of power and privilege that underpin these categories. I am non-disabled, for example, not because I have no obvious physical impairments, but because the social structures around me are built to accommodate and normalize my particular bodily capacities and incapacities. My rapidly deteriorating vision, for example, is not a significant barrier to my full functioning at home, work, or play. I'm non-disabled then in the sense that the world is built with me in mind. So when I say that I'm a cisgender, heterosexual, non-disabled white settler, I'm not hearkening to what is in my blood or DNA, or even to how particular people, for example, doctors, have classified me over the years based on my physical appearance, but to how the social structures around me are built. My identity then is about what these structures make possible in my life, what they render relatively easy, the kinds of belonging that I experience because of them, and so on. I want to offer a content note before we get too far into the talk today. I will note that we'll be talking about colonial violence today, about genocide unfolding on these very lands. I offer a moment of consent at this point, trusting each of you to judge your own capacities and curate your participation accordingly. Before I get into the heart of my comments, I'm looking for a little participation. In breakout rooms momentarily, because who doesn't love a breakout room on a Friday, I'll ask you to consider what comes to mind when you think of settler colonialism. More specifically, if I refer to colonial violence in the settler state, what ideas or examples do you think of? So as I send you into breakout rooms to think about that and to think about that in community with other folks, I invite you to leave your camera on or off as you wish. We'll keep this fairly short, and then when we return, I'll ask folks for a little bit of contributions, a little bit of a sense of the conversation from the breakout rooms, which I need to stop sharing in order to do that. Here we go.
So we have about 42, 43 people in the room. It's awesome.
Brilliant. Yeah, no, I mean, at this time of the semester especially, that's a great turnout.
Very, very good.
I mean, in part, I think this taps into, we're capturing this for the recording, of course, but I think this taps into a kind of appetite maybe for these conversations that I'm sensing in the classroom, I'm sensing from colleagues, folks at whatever point on their journey of thinking about this. I do think folks are really interested in the conversation, however ready they are to participate in it at whatever levels.
Hello, Jody. We're sending. I don't know if you can hear me. You're still, it says connecting to audio, so probably you don't hear us yet. Hello, Jody. People are going into breakout rooms. I don't know if you will be able to see one, if it will pop for you on your screen.
Let's see.
And if
Oh,
you
there we
need
go.
help getting into breakout rooms, let us know, or actually,
Yeah, I can assign Jody to a breakout room right now.
Okay.
I'm just going to send a quick note to everyone, letting them know that I'm going to close them momentarily.
One of the things I'm really grateful for when I moved to Canada was moving to Prince George, because of course I had no consciousness of uh, indigenization and decolonization in any way, shape, or form. You know, even the irony I always find is that my hometown is called Barquisimeto, and we have all these indigenous names, but of course everything rested in the past. And I personally took so much pride in the fact that we are one of the oldest cities in my country, founded in 1552, and it was something that was important to me because of the education I received. But then coming and learning about these things, it's like, oh, it has really made me rethink, what was important and why it was important to me. Yeah. And then the places, because we've moved to many places. So even in Ohio, we were in the Cuyahoga County, why that name, So,
oh yeah, the naming of
the naming has been something that
cities and mountains and features of the landscape for sure is a key part of this project. Okay, as you'll see that I've closed the breakout room, so folks will be trickling back in here.
Close in 37 seconds, I said 36, 35. That's in a name.
Hey, welcome back, everyone, and thank you for your willingness to participate in this way on a Friday late in the semester. Can I ask if folks are willing to share, if that's in chat or if that if someone wants to raise a hand or unmute themselves? I'd love to hear a couple of examples at least. So what comes to mind when you hear the phrase colonial violence? Is that Bryn? Is that a hand?
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much. Also, I'm just really looking forward to this, and the breakout rooms are so good. I tend to be really shy, and then I'm like, oh, I should jump off, but it is so useful and good, and I so appreciate it. But yeah, we talked about a bunch. But I was talking about, we were reading Sand Talk, How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World in one of my in my criticism class, and talking about like even how when we try to use Indigenous thinking to save the world, we're distorting it and not appreciating it and just taking pieces of it. And so he was talking about how we have to shift that thinking, and then also this idea that like the past is ever present for Indigenous people in Canada. So even though we see these things as in the past, it's like this like ghost that's ever present. So there's this constant violence on the soul and psyche and everything. So yeah, I was with some great people. Morgan, I wrote down, and I can't remember your name. But anyway, yeah, we had a great group.
Oh, thank you, Bryn. And now I don't need to give the talk because you've just touched some of the key ideas. And I'll come right back to one of them momentarily. And is that, do I pronounce that Amatos?
Yeah, Eliana, hi.
Hi.
Yes, so we were talking about violence to us silence, not talking about it.
Mm.
We are here in Nova Scotia, and when Carlos and I used to live in BC before. And when we moved to Nova Scotia, we were amazed at how we don't see any Indigenous presence as we used to see it in BC. And it feels here that we don't talk about it, we don't mention it, kids at school don't know about residential schools. It's just that seems very violent to us, not talking about it. It's like nothing happens. And if we don't talk about it, it doesn't exist, and then we're okay.
Yeah, thank you. That's such an important point. Can I ask for one more? Oh, I see something in the chat. Let me see if I can catch up here. Colonial violence, white privilege, North American epistemology, personal colonial heritage. Yes, thank you. And everyone has anticipated where I'm going. And that is, when we think of colonial violence, when we hear about colonial violence, maybe is how I'll put it, in mainstream media accounts, for example, we tend to hear about things like residential schooling, things like chronic underfunding of child welfare systems, for example. And those are really important examples. I don't for a moment mean to take away from those, but what each of these comments hints at is really what I want to emphasize, and that's what we might call epistemological violence. And that is how, what happens if and when Indigenous knowledge systems are taken up, or when they're not, right? As some of those comments hint at, the point about silence in particular. And so that point about, what gets talked about, what doesn't get talked about, how it gets talked about, whose knowledge systems are centered, is really important in terms of where we're going. So thank you very, very much for again, for that participation, with which I will jump back into. Right. So in what follows, and drawing from time to time on some of my own recent writing, I outline the process by which I came to think about my own set of responsibilities and action with respect to my teaching activities specifically. This is not, to be clear, to suggest that I have this figured out or that there's any point of completion to this work. As you'll soon hear, I described it to my partner a day or two ago as basically like, a litany of screw-ups along the way as I've tried to figure out, how to do this work in the classroom. So I don't for a moment mean to position myself as an expert here, but rather as somebody who is committed to the process and is trying to learn from, those mistakes as I take risks along the way. What I'm storying, as I just indicated, is a series of moments that illustrate how much I had and have to both learn and unlearn. And I think, and both of those are key, as we'll hear. So in today's talk, I aim to outline how I've come to understand my professional responsibilities, not simply according to institutional processes and logics, but through the lens of my complicity in ongoing colonial violence. In other words, I do so with an eye towards reckoning with a genocidal past and present, and building a more just future. That point about the ghosts of the present is a really vital one. In the reflections I'll share with you today, I'll aim to walk you down the path that I've taken as I've started to reckon with these questions, inviting you to consider your own path. Again, not because mine is the correct or right or even necessarily a thoughtful path. I think and hope that it is. I'm doing that work, but it's certainly not the only path that one can take. As you'll soon hear, I've made many mistakes as I've done this work. My point today is to highlight the value and importance for each of us in following our own paths, making our own mistakes, learning from them, and sharing these learnings with each other as we do this work collaboratively and relationally. I think there of the comment about silence, right? Not only is there too often a kind of silence around these questions more broadly, but then I think there's often a silence like, we might all be thinking about this in some way, like how could we address this in our teaching practices, for example. But I don't think there are enough spaces in which we do that collaboratively, in which we share those, those moments of success, those challenges, the learning moments, just as importantly. Finally, I must note that my own story, though I story my own journey here, it was and is never simply my own. This too, Grande points out, is one of the violences of the academy. In Grande's words, the journey is not about the self, which means it is not about promotion and tenure. It is about the disruption and dismantling of those structures and processes that create hierarchies of individual worth and labor. So I share my seemingly individual stories here for the purpose of highlighting the possibilities in collective refusals of the dominant logics of both teaching and the academy more broadly. Both the learning and unlearning reflected in these stories were and are possible only through centering my own relational accountability with colleagues, friends, and the ongoing histories of which I'm a part. Fall 2012, I'm teaching Social Science 5101, Research Design. This is a graduate level course on research methods and methodology, and I teach it largely as a philosophy of inquiry course. We start the course with a discussion of research paradigms, reading Guba and Lincoln's touchstone work on competing paradigms in qualitative research, and Lincoln, Lynham, and Guba's later piece on paradigmatic controversies, contradictions, and emerging confluences revisited. At a certain point in an in-class conversation, a generous and thoughtful student from Sikóóhkotok Nation, part of the Blackfoot Confederacy, asks me, where is an indigenous research paradigm? I fumble through an answer in which I read this student's question through Guba and Lincoln's work. Though I recall being unsatisfied with my answer, I was recently revisiting the notes I left for myself during this course, and nowhere did I make a comment about this vital question. Nowhere did I write anything like the message I would now scribble, which would read something like this. You are entirely stuck in your own colonial worldview. This student, studying in a colonial institution located on his own homelands, offered you an important call to accountability. He was asking you to both support his learning and rise to your responsibilities as a settler on these lands, and you did neither. You need to do better. You need to go find the work of Maori scholar Linda Toy Smith, Cree scholar Sean Wilson, Nehia and Salto scholar Margaret Kovac, and many others who are already writing compellingly about indigenous research paradigms by the time you were teaching this course. Not only will this be part of you taking up your responsibilities as a settler, but it will make you a better teacher and deeper thinker. I was not ready for this note at the time. It was perhaps 3 years after this important question that it struck me one day, rather belatedly, that my whole life really, that all of my teaching and research, but also my life more broadly, was incredibly unreflexively white. Though I'd been teaching about whiteness and ableism and societal patriarchy in the classroom for years by that point, it took that long for me to see how thoroughly these systems of power and privilege were written into my own life, and specifically in the context of this talk, how thoroughly my own teaching practices were entangled with settler colonialism. The epistemic violence I referred to earlier is not an abstraction. It unfolds in real time in real specific classrooms. This one day, I realized that it was unfolding in my classrooms, even as I took a critical approach to my courses. I was doing very little to decenter white Eurocentric ways of knowing in my classrooms. That day, I knew I had much work to do. I'll still do. In recent years, a burgeoning body of literature has taken shape interrogating the whiteness of Western academic structures, curricula, research activities, organizational cultures, and more. This is perhaps unsurprising, given that universities on lands claimed by Canada and the United States emerged as part of the projects of Christianizing Indigenous youth and ensuring settler futurity, to borrow from Rosalind Hampton, through teaching, quote, Protestantism, the English language, and British culture to the white settler youth of the growing colony, end quote. Academic disciplines, and indeed the institutions themselves, are structured by and serve to reproduce particular white Western bodies of knowledge as revered and respected, erasing or marginalizing other ontological, epistemological, or axiological frameworks in the process, or as we heard from Bryn, picking them up selectively and then treating them, not treating them with the care and the reverence that they deserve. Indeed, the university, Daigle expounds, is, quote, a crucial site of settler colonial relations, as well as an intrinsic part of the settler colonial state, end quote. Grande puts it provocatively, arguing that the university is, quote, an arm of the settler state, a site where the logic of elimination, capital accumulation, and dispossession are reconstituted, end quote. The logics, that is, that shape and reproduce the university, and are shaped by and reproduced by the university, are necessarily and inextricably tied to those logics foundational to the reproduction of settler colonialism itself, especially the imperatives of neoliberal global capitalism. The university does all of this, but who is the university? How is it constituted or reconstituted? It is us, of course. It is the people in this Zoom room, as well as, of course, those not in the room. Through what we study and don't study, how we do so, who we have students read and not read, in the classroom and in innumerable other ways, we are part of the shaping and reshaping of the university in a present simultaneously tethered to the genocidal histories of the institution in the settler state and working toward the production of very particular futures. In contemporary settler Canada, mainstream political discourse seems to suggest that we are reckoning with the darkest moments in our past, emphasis here on past. It is worth lingering here, though, as one important feature of contemporary Canada is our, and by that I mean settlers and the settler state, our collective relationship to histories of colonization. In 2008, then Prime Minister Stephen Harper issued a formal apology for the residential school system in the House of Commons. Drawing on the work of Eva Mackey, Australian scholar Lisa Slater argues that this supposedly watershed moment, quote, does not require Canadians to account for how the processes of land theft and cultural genocide are foundational to the modern nation state, making the broader colonial process into something containable and apologizable, end quote. It is this posture of distance that we see in contemporary discussions of the violences of settler colonialism. In the summer of 2021, for instance, Canada made international news with repeated discoveries, very much in quotation marks, of hundreds and ultimately thousands of unmarked graves near the sites of former residential schools. While this provoked considerable national discussion and made international headlines, it was also a profoundly colonial response to colonial violence. First, that this constituted news was itself only possible through a kind of cultivated ignorance, as Indigenous leaders have long been testifying that many of the children forced to attend residential schools never made it home and were buried in unmarked graves. Excuse me. In fact, the fourth volume of the final report of the TRC is entitled Canada's Residential Schools, Missing Children and Unmarked Burials. In other words, ground-penetrating radar was not the first evidence of these unmarked graves. It was simply the first evidence that could not be conveniently ignored by insisting on Euro-Western notions of evidence. Second, Canada's performative hand-wringing re-traumatized those who survived the horrors of residential school, as well as those living in the wake of the intergenerational traumas perpetuated by this system, insisting that they relive the trauma for and through mediated accounts written largely for the consumption of settlers. Third, and most directly relevant to the current topic, this national conversation has done little or nothing to disrupt the idea that colonial violence is a thing of the past. This means, of course, that there is little conversation, these are the silences that we heard referred to earlier, little conversation in mainstream spaces about the ongoing violences of settler colonialism as it lives and breathes in institutions such as child welfare and the criminal justice system, both in quotation marks. For our purposes today, it also means that there is too little conversation about how settler colonialism lives and breathes in institutions of so-called higher education, of how it lives and breathes in our classrooms at the very same moments that universities are crafting and delivering land acknowledgements and referring to decolonization, indigenization, and or reconciliation. 2015, my partner and I, along with our two kiddos, have recently returned from a year away from home. We're avid readers, including reading for pleasure outside of our academic work. My reflections on the whiteness of our lives have sparked a number of conversations, and these have both of us noticing the whiteness of our bookshelves. Barbara Kingsolver, John Irving, and Diana Gabaldon, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, are among the favorites gracing our shelves. These go-tos are punctuated by the likes of Khalid Hosseini's The Kite Runner and Rohinton Mysteries, A Fine Balance in Family Matters. There's a striking absence, however, of Indigenous authors on our shelves, particularly Indigenous authors writing from the very lands that we occupy. Though I'm not yet sure of how to address the whiteness of my working life, I am clear that I must revise my popular cultural diet. We reach out to a dear friend with expertise in Indigenous literatures for some advice. Before long, our shelves are overflowing with Cherie Dimaline, Katharina Vermette, Joshua Whitehead, Leanne Simpson, Richard Van Camp, Lee Miracle, Thomas King, and Eden Robinson. This is long overdue and is the lowest hanging fruit. I have yet to do any work to unsettle my teaching, yet to change the day-to-day contours of my life in any real way. Yet this is an important start that will help position me for deeper work in the years to come. Winter 2017. I know I have work to do in the classroom, but I'm not really sure where to begin. This, I will later understand, is because I had and have a good deal of unlearning to do, as well as much more learning. I need to unlearn much of what I encountered in grad school and academia more generally about what good, rigorous scholarship looks like, about what knowledge means, who has the right to hold knowledge, what shapes it takes. This is not to abandon any notions of the quality of my and our work, but to recognize that most of our discussions of quality are themselves tethered to Eurocentric conceptualizations of what counts as knowledge, what it means to be a knower or an expert, and the processes by which we come to know. Teaching the same graduate level course in the spring 2017 semester, it's winter in Southern Alberta, but in an institutionally enshrined moment of denial, like a process of denial, we call it the spring semester that starts in January here. I realize that that's where I need to start. I love teaching research methodology, as it's now called, and do it well in many respects. This particular semester, I start putting into practice the thinking and reading I've been doing towards unsettling my teaching. I teach sections on paradigms, politics and praxis, ethics and reflexivity, and representation before we get to research presentations. It's in the section on representation where I began my unsettling work, weaving in episodes of Haudenosaunee scholar artist Skawonati Fragnito's Machinima film series, The Time Traveler, pictured here, an article by Cherokee Hawaiian Samoan scholar Jason Lewis and Fragnito on artwork as argument, and an analysis of Time Traveler by Treva Michelle Pullen. As I wade into the conversations that these texts engender, I find myself outside of my comfort zone, well outside of my comfort zone. And with each conversation, I feel better equipped for the next. I don't mean better equipped in the sense of having or claiming or assuming a kind of expertise, but better equipped in that I've just started to become more comfortable with being out of my comfort zone, with stretching myself in these ways, with recognizing the limits, or at least some of the limits of my understanding. As I'm working on this graduate level class, I leave myself a note in a course planning document for my undergraduate Qualitative Research Methods course. February 6th, 2017. I'm assigning 2 works in my grad class that I might want to consider for 3120 next time, the number of that course, obviously. If so, I could have a week on decolonizing methods, but maybe that contains it too much, and or consider weaving it in elsewhere. Paradigms could work, arts-based could work. Then what would I do in terms of assessment? Here, I am finally, belatedly, starting to rethink my courses. I'm starting to think not simply about how I can add diversity and stir, an approach Sarah Ahmed and others have thoroughly critiqued, but about how I might engage with ideas, authors, and paradigms I'm only now doing the work to familiarize myself with. My partner will remind me numerous times during this process that it's like I'm learning a new language, and this seems to me an apt metaphor, both for the process of learning itself and in the sense that language structures what is thinkable, how we understand ourselves and the social worlds of which we are a part. In this sense, I'm very much still in the learning basic vocabulary stage of language acquisition, but I am all in. In the coming years, I will rebuild these first 2 courses substantially. This will start with the inclusion in quotation marks, of different voices and perspectives. What will soon become apparent, however, is that seriously engaging with these voices and perspectives will fundamentally shift the conversations we're having. I will come to teach Unagak scholar Eve Tuck in the section on ethics, a move that will enable a vital conversation about axiology as ethics. I will teach Kim Talbert's work when we discuss ethnography. This will open up a new and important conversation about relationality and relational accountability in ethnographic work. My point here is not that these courses are now fixed. In fact, I'll be revisiting this particular qualitative methods course in the coming weeks as I prepare to teach it next semester for the first time in 3 years. I know that I will be revising several pieces as I reflect on what I still need to learn and unlearn. Rather, my point is that the process of imagining what this course could look like, how I might unsettle my own approach to it, has made it a better course and me a better teacher. I've taken these lessons into my other courses, where I found that the work of unsettling these first courses has eased the work of doing so in each subsequent course I've considered. Moreover, each time I teach one of these courses and find that new conversations have been opened up, I'm expanding my capacity to continue this work in all of my courses and in a growing number of other spaces. I also make a point in each of these courses to be explicit with students about the choices I'm making, the axiological commitments underlying these choices, and the unlearning processes in which I will always be engaged. In pulling back this particular curtain, I aim to encourage them in their own learning and unlearning journeys and equip them to hold their professors, me included, to account for the work that we are and are not doing in these directions. In a Facebook post from April 8th, 2018, I asked friends for some advice and or resources. Hive Mind, working on decolonizing, in quotation marks, my Soci-Stats course for next year. Sources, ideas, data sets welcome. I'd love some data on how politically engaged Indigenous youth are, for example, but also some readings on stats as a tool of whiteness, of course. While this post generated some important insights and suggestions, I was called in by a dear friend who noted that I needed to, quote, be mindful about the word decolonizing without material relation to land, suggesting that I engage with Eve Tuck and Kei Wayne Yang's piece, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. My post, as well as the responses to it, points to the kinds of conversations unfolding in academia. In the first instance, much work is underway in academic and many other institutional spaces, particularly since the final report of the TRC was released in 2015, to address the legacies of settler colonialism. In the hallways, classrooms, and boardrooms of university and college campuses, as well as the pages of academic publications, much lip service, and I use that term consciously rather, is paid to equity, diversity, and inclusion generally, and decolonization, indigenization, and reconciliation more specifically. In the second instance, these terms are often deployed without a critical interrogation of the ideas themselves or the ways in which they have too often been mobilized, including by me, as what Sarah Ahmed calls non-performatives, things, quote, said or done as a way of not doing something, as a way of obscuring what is not being done, end quote. Decolonization is arguably the most loaded of these terms. As Tuck and Yang note, the metaphorization of decolonization, its mobilization without sustained engagement with the material politics of land dispossession and more, presents real dangers. Quote, when metaphor invades decolonization, it kills the very possibility of decolonization. It recenters whiteness, it resettles theory, it extends innocence to the settler, it entertains a settler future. This is what I was doing in the approach that I was taking to my stats course. With their intervention, Tuck and Yang aim to, quote, remind readers what is unsettling about decolonization, what is unsettling and should be unsettling. In other words, the metaphorization of decolonization is too easy, too comfortable, too settled. Indigenization, representing in Gaudry and Lorenz's terms a move to expand the Academy's still narrow conceptions of knowledge to include Indigenous perspectives in transformative ways, end quote, continues to have purchase as an idea towards which academic institutions should aspire. Where things start to get rather murky, though, is in the how, the particular shape that this process might take. Too often, indigenization is operationalized by university administrators and others as a particular version of inclusion, ostensibly achieved by hiring more Indigenous scholars and staff and recruiting more Indigenous students. As numerous observers have noted, however, simply including more bodies seem to stand for, even be, diversity, leaves the dominant systems and structures themselves intact. Indeed, not only does this kind of inclusion do little to question or change the underlying colonialist, gendered, ableist, transphobic, etc., logics and practices of academia, it subjects these quote-unquote diverse students, faculty, and staff to institutional cultures that continue to be sites of ontological and epistemological violence. In other words, which bodies of knowledge and ways of knowing are centered and which are erased, ignored, trivialized, or mistreated reveals much about the Euro-Western foundations of academia, foundations that continue to be reproduced through curricula, course readings, research funding structures, administrative policies and processes, teaching center programming or lack thereof, and much more. Moreover, it leaves uninterrogated and untroubled the dominant understandings of knowledge and knowledge production that instantiate much of that violence, as Gaudry and Lorenz explain. Quote, when indigenization is understood as a means to include Indigenous people better in the Academy, it also tends to assume that the Academy is a natural or at least neutral place in which human knowledge is already adequately represented, end quote. Finally, reconciliation is a term often marshaled in national, provincial, and more localized conversations in the wake of the TRC. Once again, it might seem like an idea worthy of aspiration. Numerous scholars have taken up this question, pointing to the limitations, even dangers, of discourses of reconciliation. As a starting point, we must situate any discussion of reconciliation within what Yellowknives Dene scholar Glenn Coulthard calls a new modus operandi of colonial power. Coulthard argues that over the past 50 years or so, there's been a shift in Canada, quote, from a more or less unconcealed structure of domination to a form of colonial governmentality that works through the medium of state recognition and accommodation, end quote. Discourses of reconciliation in Canada, then, are part of the politics of recognition that function to continue the project of reproducing settler rule. Building on the work of Frantz Fanon, Coulthard argues that, quote, in situations where colonial rule does not depend solely on the exercise of state violence, its reproduction instead rests on the ability to entice Indigenous peoples to identify, either implicitly or explicitly, with the profoundly asymmetrical and non-reciprocal forms of recognition either imposed on or granted to them by the settler state and society. The politics of recognition, then, work to ensure that all discussions start from the premise that the settler state is legitimate and that we should look to settler state policies and structures to address any grievances or inequalities. Alicia Elliott points towards the ways in which reconciliation discourse has been mobilized by the settler state as part of a branding process following the work and calls to action of the TRC. Eliot provocatively highlights reconciliation with a copyright C, gesturing to the ways the term has been folded into mainstream political and institutional discourse while leaving intact, even buttressing, dominant institutions and processes. It is in this sense that Corntassel refers to reconciliation processes as the politics of distraction, and Audra Simpson calls reconciliation an impossible but therapeutic fallacy. The therapeutic refers to the sense in which it is therapeutic for settlers and the settler state, allowing us, again in quotation marks, to signal our commitments to working with, also in quotation marks, Indigenous peoples and communities without having to reimagine our dominant political or professional institutions and practices, or to give up any of the wealth and privilege accumulated through dispossession and colonial violence. As Kissock puts it, drawing on the work of Paulette Regan, the quote, politics of reconciliation operates to cover over colonial violence, both past and present, with the belief that Canada and settler Canadians are a constant good work in progress, end quote. Daigle, meanwhile, suggests that Canada is in an era marked by the spectacle of reconciliation, quote, a public, large-scale, and visually striking performance of Indigenous suffering and trauma, alongside white settler mourning and recognition, which secures, legitimates, and effectively, and I would note affectively, reproduces white supremacy and settler futurity in Canada, end quote. Sarah Ahmed makes a similar point, a related point rather, arguing that public proclamations of national shame, such as those tied to Harper's 2008 apology, acknowledge the pain and suffering of others, in this case Indigenous peoples, yet at the same time call the nation into being, asserting a particular kind of nationhood, a particular we-ness. Ahmed provocatively argues those who center, oh, what have I done here? There we go. Those who witness, rather, the past injustice through feeling national shame are aligned with each other as well-meaning individuals. If you feel shame, you are in the nation, a nation that means well. Shame makes the nation in the witnessing of past injustice, a witnessing that involves feeling shame, as it exposes the failure of the nation to live up to its ideals. But this exposure is temporary and becomes the ground for a narrative of national recovery. By witnessing what is shameful about the past, the nation can live up to the ideals that secure its identity and being in the present. Here, I suggest that we might think carefully about the particular kinds of we-ness that unfold when institutions of higher learning invoke ideas like reconciliation while continuing to enact colonial violence in the present. July 2023. This is my third time teaching a course I've built called Sport, Recreation, and Settler Colonialism. It took me years of work to feel ready to build and offer this course. Now that I've done so a few times, I can say without a doubt that it is by far my favorite course to teach. I am deeply nourished by the conversations we get to have over the length of the semester, by the enthusiasm of students as they engage with difficult texts and ideas, and by the Indigenous scholars and activists whose work is centered in these courses, both in readings and in Zoom visits I organize throughout the semester. This is my first time teaching the course in person, as the other offerings have been online during the worst of the COVID-19 pandemic. As I imagine what this course will feel like in person, it dawns on me that I should invite one of the elders in residence to start the course in ceremony, to set the stage for the challenging conversations we'll have. In my imagination, Elder First Charger will attend day one of the course, offer a brief ceremony and prayer at the outset, then I will proceed with my lesson plan for day one, as I'm a little bit precious about my day one. In my conversation with him, Elder First Charger says he'll be happy to provide a blessing and indicates that he'll have a PowerPoint presentation ready. A voice inside my head says, whoa, 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 this is my course. I need to get some key ideas on the table right off the hop. Even after several years of committing myself to this work, I still find myself stuck in my own colonial bullshit, for lack of a better word. Here, I'm taking an extractivist approach to starting my course in ceremony, of all things. Thankfully, with practice, I'm developing the capacity to see how my own colonial views and assumptions show up at moments like this, in voices like this. So I ignore this little voice, realizing that Elder First Charger has offered me an important teaching. If you want to center Indigenous voices and ways of knowing in this course, then that needs to inform every decision you make. So, several weeks later, after a beautiful blessing and prayer, I sit in the classroom along with approximately 45 students as Elder First Charger works through a PowerPoint presentation we hadn't talked about at all. I didn't know what he was going to say, whether it would be about sport at all, mostly it wasn't, or how it would land for students. I barely spoke that day, doing so only to welcome students, keep them a bit busy discussing both the value and limitations of land acknowledgements while Elder First Charger made his way to the classroom, and then introduce him when we were ready to do so. Later, reading students' first reflection assignments, I was struck by how meaningful that first day was for them. I had no sense of what Elder First Charger was going to talk about, and the connection between his comments and our course was not terribly obvious to me, but students, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, were enthralled by what he shared and how he did so. One Blackfoot student reflected, quote, "Starting the course with a ceremony by Francis First Charger was a very respectful and welcoming way to introduce yourself. By starting with a smudge, I felt welcomed, safe, and respected," end quote. A settler student, meanwhile, offered the following reflection, quote, "I really enjoyed starting the course with a ceremony led by Blackfoot Elder Francis First Charger. It was powerful, emotional, and set the tone of this class for the semester. To open the course with an Indigenous-led ceremony instead of a white settler preaching at the front of the room about settler colonialism was an appropriate and necessary move for this course especially," end quote. Not only did Elder First Charger offer students valuable entry points into course materials and ideas, but he taught me something vital in that moment. As I reflect on it now, I'm struck again by the fact that he did not ask me what I wanted him to talk about or check in with me in any way. He did commend me on my course outline, but asked nothing else about the course, how I planned to teach it, or how day one fit into the overall arc. Instead, he simply talked about what he wanted students to know about, some vital insights into who he was and is, histories of the lands on which we were meeting that day, Blackfoot ways of knowing, and more. In that sense, he taught both students and me something of our responsibilities for learning and unlearning in this particular social context in which we were doing so. I'd be remiss if I failed to name and acknowledge the privilege that has made the work I've described here today and other work I'm doing in these directions possible. I'm a mid-career, very much flirting, as you'll see by the gray in my beard, with late career academic, with tenure, with a teaching load that provides time for reflection on what I'm doing, how, and why. What's more, as a cis-het, white, settler-abled man, I live at the intersection of essentially every system of privilege that there is. This affords me an enormous amount of license to try things in the classroom from a position of tremendous security. For example, in the last few years, I've really been trying to refuse the dominant logics of assessment, something I'm happy to address in the talk afterwards, after the talk rather, if folks are interested. It's also vital to be explicit about a couple of key elements of the cultural politics of doing this work. As Anishinaabe scholar Tricia McGuire-Adams reminds us, it is at one and the same time important that settler scholars contribute to the work of challenging settler colonialism, and vital that we do so conscious of the privilege that we bring to such work, following the lead of Indigenous scholars and activists, and actively attending to how our own white supremacist and colonial investments and assumptions show up as we do this work. As I creep closer to the end of my career than to the beginning, increasingly I find myself reflecting on the classroom as the most important space of social change in my professional life. When I write something for an academic publication, particularly when that something is paywalled, it has limited reach. By contrast, if I can do something important in the classroom, students with whom I have the privilege of working will take that with them into their future studies, work, and social lives. The problem is, whether I do something important or not, students will carry what I do and don't do with them. So it is worth thinking carefully about the ideas that I'm producing and reproducing in the classroom. What are the ideas, people, and knowledge systems centered in my course? Who in the classroom will see themselves and their life experiences represented? Who will understand their own relationships to the lands we collectively occupy, and in what way? I offer the reflections shared here today as an invitation, not an invitation to do these particular things. I think that would miss the point entirely. Rather, this is an invitation to pick up one of my first questions for you, to consider the lands you occupy and your responsibilities in relation to them and to the Indigenous peoples whose connections to these lands have been and continue to be targeted in and by the settler state, again, including the university itself. What's more, it is an invitation to engage in this work wherever you find yourself along your own pathway in relation to one another. The prevailing logics of academia would have us think of our courses as intellectual property, would have us working in relative isolation from one another, would have us running on the hamster wheels of tenure, promotion, and annual evaluation. What if, to borrow from Cherokee Nation scholar Daniel Heath Justice, we were to imagine otherwise? What might doing so render thinkable? What kind of university, what kind of social world might we help build? The last words here go to Justice himself. Quote, Geary Hobson, author of The Last of the Ophos, ends with a simple but provocative phrase, keep a fire. Those words are a reminder, an affirmation, and a commitment all at once. They hold us accountable and hold us up. It's a phrase about the work we do and the reasons we do it, and makes clear that our task is to feed that fire, protect it, keep it going. It won't live on its own without attention and care. Like anything that matters, we've got to look after it. End quote. Thank you. I'm super happy seeing some of the faces in the Zoom room, faces that I know and love. And I'd love to have, if we've got a bit of time for conversation, Juan Carlos, I would just love to open that up.
We do. So raise your hand, unmute yourself, speak up. Thank you, Jay. That was wonderful. And the floor is open. So ask your questions. Go ahead, Sasha.
Hi, Jay. Thank you for that presentation. I have a lot of questions, I guess, but I am an Indigenous scholar from Mount Allison University from Nottawaganeg First Nation. I think my first question would be, and I probably don't have time to ask anymore, but I'll just ask this. When you were reading Wilson, Kovac, Smith, did you notice any commonality in those writings? Any positionality, I guess?
Oh, positionality, absolutely. How do I answer that question? How do I start to feel my way through that question? I mean, in some ways, I'm going back to what Juan Carlos said in his land acknowledgement about listening and listening and listening and listening. And so I think over time, I certainly started to see some commonalities, some important threads, while always wanting to remind myself in this work of complexity, right? One of the violences of settler colonialism, of course, is the homogenization of different knowledge systems, different, worldviews, kinship systems, and more. And so I wanted to attend to the specificity of the work that they were doing, writing in very different contexts and from very different positions. And to your question about positionality, that's central in almost all of the work that I've encountered, that I've gone seeking out. Thinking about like, how is this specific to and shaped by, the particular context in which I'm writing, the particular lands that I occupy, my relationships to them. I don't know if that quite addresses your question, though. Can I invite you to follow up?
Yeah, sure. So for me, how do I say this now without sounding? It's like in Black scholarship, for example, in the 60s, you could see a huge change from then until now, right? Where there's a freedom in how they're writing and what African scholars are writing and how they're writing. And Smith and Kovac and Wilson all kind of fit into this sort of decolonizing methodologies, decolonizing systems sort of framing, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it, when I was doing my PhD research, didn't sit with me as an Indigenous scholar because I wasn't the type of Indian they were saying that we are. So I found it very positioning in the way that it was culturizing me, that I was supposed to identify through my attributes and through our, what my group might practice in their lives. And so I struggled a lot with that. And I find when people are new to Indigenous scholarship, not saying you are, but people that are new to it, they really absorb and buy into that because those three are predominantly, the sort of trailblazers, if you will. And then if you look at works like Tuck and Wente, and just recently I went to a talk at UNB, not recently, months ago, about this poet named Lee, who says, I want to wear my red dress now. And Wente, who challenges how we're portrayed in art and things like that. But with Smith and Kovac and Wilson, it's very much, you start with this idea that you're traditional and ceremonial and spiritual, and then your research stems from that. So, and I've had these debates with other Indigenous scholars, like, well, you're colonized, you're assimilated, and that's not really a fair categorization of me either, right? If you look at Thomas King, who did that film back in the 80s, I think it was, I'm Not the Indian You Had in Mind. And he was challenging these sort of narratives. And then in Indigenous scholarship, I read over and over and over how everybody is using Smith, Kovac, and I'm thinking, okay, you know, it's not one or the other. It's not what I'm saying, but like I'd like a little bit of cultural negotiation here, you know, because it's not culture that determines who we are. It's supposed to be the people in that culture who determine it, right? Anyway, I just wanted to see if you noticed anything. I wonder that, and I appreciate that you are, you know, a non-Indigenous and hosting a session like this, because instantly I was unsettled by that. Do you know what I mean? And your thing was called Unsettling, and I was like, how's this going to go for him? But you know, that's great though, people are grappling with these things now, not just Indigenous scholars, right? So anyway.
Yeah,
That's all.
I mean, thank you for the question and the elaboration on it. And I mean, your point is a vitally important one. And for me, those, I don't even know actually if those were the particular entry points, so much as, you know, thinking back now to the question that particular student answered, like, or asked, posed in 2012. You know, those are among the first folks that come to mind who have written about it at that level. But I'm also like, again, it's about complexity for me. And so it's about like, do I want to teach Sean Wilson in qualitative research methods next semester? Yes, I do. Do I also want to teach Tricia McGuire Adams? Do I also want to teach Eve Tuck and Leanne Simpson? Because they're bringing something different, and they're writing from and about different positions and with different sets of axiological and political commitments. Absolutely. And one of the reasons for doing so, as I'm hearing if I'm hearing your comment and question correctly, if I'm interpreting it correctly, is to keep that complexity centered, keep those like to refuse that idea, well, you know, here is the Indigenous answer to this, right? That's always a violence. That sort of homogenization is always a violence. And so that's, yeah, so that, I hope that goes some way towards addressing your point.
I think we have time for one more question to officially end the session, but if we have some extra time, I'm happy to stay a bit longer in the call, but I think we can get one more question in. Anyone wants to jump in?
If no one will.
You've got another one. Yeah, go.
I think somebody put one in the chat though, Juan.
Oh, thank you. Catch up.
Thank you, Jay. Oh, maybe not. Independent study. Oh yeah, sorry.
Fine.
Ask your question, Sasha.
Yeah, please, Sasha.
Okay. I'm thinking about the TRC. And for me, it's so interesting that I understand the purpose of it. I understand all of that. What I grapple with, or what I don't understand, is those calls to action that call on the government to collect more statistics about us, knowing the damage and deficit framework that the government has put out there, and knowing the cycle of damage that feeds, you know, when you collect a story on somebody and tell a story on them. And this really plays out in our communities like you wouldn't believe. Like so I run a summer program here on the communities, and anyway, you don't need to know all that. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are when presenting the TRC, you're talking about it. And I know there's a big, you know, there's a lot of challenging conversations going on about the TRC right now, and the government's or institutional ways to fulfill it. But I'm just curious of I guess your thoughts on those calls to action that require the government to collect more statistics and report.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's such an important point. And so when I actually don't talk about the TRC a lot in the context of the classroom. I mean, I do. You know, I name it, and I want to honor and value the work that was done, and the testimony of survivors and all of that. So without wanting to take away from that at all, I also like when I take up the TRC in the classroom, I often talk about like what work the TRC is doing, right? Like what are the conversations that are fostered, and what are those that are rendered unthinkable because the TRC occupies the space that it occupies. And so one dimension of that is exactly the point that you're making, is that it's, you know, it's calling for yet more research, you know, that is generally has historically and continues, I think, in the present to be too often, and, you know, research on Indigenous peoples. We need more data, we need more whatever. And your comment actually made me think of there's a great chapter by Maggie Walter and Chris Anderson, if I remember correctly, in a book called Indigenous Statistics, called Deficit Indigène, and it is very much about the how the very operationalizing of these things when data are gathered is actually part of reproducing that exact cycle that you just mentioned, right? Reproducing the idea of deficit, which then does all of the work that it does. The other way, and this doesn't address your question, but just while we're here, the other way that I try to not trouble but like interrogate the TRC, again, as it's been taken up in mainstream conversations, is it doesn't have us reckon with the present, right? Because it is about harm that can be too neatly located in the past. It doesn't call us really to reckon with child welfare in the present, with the so-called criminal justice system in the present, and all of those things. And so the TRC itself, I think, is one that I try to treat with some care, and again point to complexities. And by naming calls to action and bringing those to bear in the classroom when they're relevant to conversations, but also asking like what kinds of work, those calls to action, what other kinds of work does this do? Like, this does a particular kind of work towards so-called truth and reconciliation, and I say so-called for all of the reasons that we've hinted at and many more. But also, like, what are the dangers that are lying there, that I absolutely hear bubbling in your question.
Thank you very much for the talk and the participation. I'm going to stop the recording now, but if you want to talk a bit more, I'm open to that. So